March 8, 1944, 28,000 feet above the Philippine Sea. Captain Lewis Mac McAllister pushed the throttle forward and watched the cylinder head temperature gauge climb into the red. The Packard-built Merlin V1650 engine beneath the cowling of his P-51B Mustang was screaming, gulping thin air at nearly 5 miles altitude, trying to maintain power while Japanese Ki-84 Frank fighters climbed effortlessly above him. The enemy aircraft were at 31,000 feet now, black silhouettes against the equatorial sun, circling like sharks that had found prey too exhausted to fight back. McAllister's Mustang could theoretically reach that altitude. The performance charts said so. The test pilots at Wright Field had proven it. But those tests had been conducted over Ohio in October, not over the Pacific in March, where ambient temperatures at altitude were 15 degrees warmer, and the engine cooling system couldn't shed heat fast enough to prevent thermal failure. His temperature gauge read 135 degrees Celsius. Maximum continuous operating temperature was 121. He was 14 degrees into the danger zone, and every second he maintained this altitude pushed the engine closer to catastrophic failure. The coolant was boiling. The radiator was saturated. Physics was winning. "Blue flight, this is Blue Leader," McAllister transmitted. "We're thermal limited, descending to 26,000. 4 acknowledgments came back, each pilot's voice carrying the same frustration. They had altitude advantage when the fight started, 28,000 feet, positioned perfectly to bounce a formation of Japanese bombers heading toward Hollandia. But the Ki-84 escorts had climbed above them with insulting ease, forcing the Mustangs into a defensive posture, negating every tactical advantage the P-51 was supposed to provide. The Frank fighters dove. McAllister rolled left, his Mustang responding instantly despite the thin air. Behind him, 2 other P-51s broke formation, evading cannon fire that stitched through the space they'd occupied a second earlier. The engagement lasted 90 seconds, a chaos of climbing turns, diving attacks, and desperate evasion, before the Japanese fighters climbed back above 30,000 feet, where the Mustangs couldn't follow without cooking their engines. McAllister checked his temperature gauge, 128 degrees and climbing even though he descended 2,000 feet. He enriched the fuel mixture, trying to cool the cylinders through evaporative fuel flow. The temperature dropped to 125, then stabilized. Good enough. Barely. "Blue flight, reform on me. We're RTB. Return to base." The mission was a failure. The bombers they were supposed to intercept had continued unmolested toward their target. The Japanese fighters had dictated the terms of engagement entirely, using altitude superiority to render the vaunted P-51 Mustang, the longest-range, highest-performance fighter in the Pacific, tactically irrelevant above 28,000 feet. McAllister brought his flight back to Hollandia Airfield at 14:35 hours. When he climbed out of the cockpit, the engine was still radiating heat like a furnace. The crew chief, Master Sergeant Dave Holbrook, placed his hand near the cowling and pulled it back immediately. "Christ, sir, you cooked this thing." Had to push it at altitude. Temperature went to 135. Holbrook's expression darkened. "That's 15 over max continuous. You're lucky the head gasket didn't blow." "I'm aware, but the Japs were sitting at 31,000 like they owned the sky. We couldn't touch them." "Because the cooling system can't handle sustained high-altitude operations in tropical ambient temperatures," said a voice behind them. McAllister turned. A civilian stood 10 feet away, wearing khaki work clothes and carrying a clipboard. He was younger than McAllister expected, maybe 30, with wire-rimmed glasses and the pale complexion of someone who spent more time in hangars than sunlight. "And you are?" "Henry Voss, engine cooling specialist. North American Aviation sent me to investigate why the P-51s are having thermal issues in the Pacific Theater." He gestured toward the Mustang. "Mind if I take a look?" McAllister nodded. Voss approached the aircraft, opened the cowling access panel, and spent 5 minutes examining the coolant system, the radiator ducting, and the cylinder head assembly. When he finished, he closed the panel and made notes on his clipboard. "Your radiator is functioning normally," Voss said. "The coolant pump is operating within specifications. The thermostat is working. Everything is exactly as designed." "So what's the problem?" "The problem is that the design assumes ambient temperatures consistent with European theater operations. Temperate climate, cooler air at altitude. But here in the Pacific, ambient temperatures are higher, humidity is higher, and the cooling system can't shed heat efficiently enough to allow sustained high-altitude operations above 28,000 feet. Voss tapped his clipboard. "North America's engineers designed a magnificent aircraft. They just didn't design it for this environment." McAllister felt a familiar frustration building. "So we're stuck at 28,000 while the Japs fly at 31. Unless someone modifies the cooling system to increase thermal efficiency." Voss looked at the Mustang thoughtfully. "Which is why I'm here." Over the next 3 days, McAllister flew 2 more missions. Both times, Japanese fighters used altitude advantage to dictate engagement parameters. Both times, the Mustangs were forced to operate below their thermal ceiling while enemy aircraft maneuvered freely above them. Both times, McAllister returned to base furious and helpless, watching his temperature gauge climb into dangerous territory whenever he tried to chase enemy fighters above 28,000 feet. On March 12, Voss found him in the officers' mess. "I think I have a solution," Voss said quietly. "To what?" "To your cooling problem." McAllister set down his coffee. "I'm listening." "The issue is thermal saturation. The radiator can't shed heat fast enough because the airflow through the cooling ducts isn't optimized for high-altitude, high-temperature operations. But there's a way to increase airflow without redesigning the entire cooling system." "How?" Voss pulled a folded paper from his pocket and spread it on the table. It showed a technical diagram of the P-51's radiator scoop and ducting system, with hand-drawn modifications marked in red ink. "You add a secondary intake here," Voss pointed to the underside of the fuselage, "and reroute a portion of the boundary layer airflow directly across the radiator fins before it exits through the main duct. It increases cooling efficiency by approximately 18% without adding weight or drag penalties." McAllister studied the diagram. "Does North American know about this?" "No, it's not an official modification. It's something I worked out last night after inspecting your aircraft." "So it's untested." "Completely. And if it doesn't work, then your cooling system performs exactly as it does now. No worse. But if it does work, you'll be able to sustain high-altitude operations at least 3,000 feet higher than current thermal limits." McAllister looked at the diagram again. 3,000 feet would put the Mustangs at 31,000 feet, exactly where the Japanese fighters were operating with impunity. "How long would it take to install?" "On one aircraft, about 12 hours. But I'd need authorization from your commanding officer, access to machine shop facilities, and a test pilot willing to fly an aircraft with an unauthorized cooling system modification." McAllister folded the paper and handed it back. "Let me talk to the co." That conversation happened 30 minutes later in Colonel Raymond Pritchard's office. Pritchard was 43, a career officer who had flown P-40s in China before transferring to the Southwest Pacific. He listened to McAllister's explanation of Voss's proposed modification, asked 3 questions, and then leaned back in his chair. "So this civilian engineer wants to modify our fighters based on a theory he developed in 3 days, using a design that hasn't been tested or approved by North American or the Air Force." "Yes, sir. And if the modification fails during flight, we lose an aircraft and possibly a pilot." "That's the risk, sir." Pritchard was quiet for a long moment. "The Ki-84s are killing us, Mac. Not because our pilots aren't good enough, but because we can't operate at the altitudes where the fights are happening. We're bringing guns to a knife fight and getting stabbed before we can shoot." He stood and walked to the window overlooking the flight line. "If this modification works, it changes the tactical equation. If it doesn't, we're no worse off than we are now." "So you'll authorize it?" "I'll authorize one test installation, one aircraft. You'll be the test pilot. If it works, we'll consider implementing it fleet-wide. If it doesn't, Voss goes back to California and we figure out something else." McAllister nodded. "Understood, sir." "And Mac, if you blow an engine at altitude because of this modification, I'm going to be very unhappy." "I'll do my best to avoid that, sir." That night, Henry Voss and Master Sergeant Holbrook began modifying the cooling system on McAllister's P-51B. They worked by flashlight and hanger lamps, cutting new ducting, fabricating intake scoops from aluminum sheet, and rerouting airflow paths through the radiator assembly. It took 16 hours instead of 12, finishing at 800 hours on March 14. When Voss finally stepped back from the aircraft, his hands were cut, his coveralls were soaked with sweat, and his eyes carried the exhausted intensity of someone who had just bet his career on a theory that existed only in his head. "It's done," he said quietly. McAllister looked at the modified cooling system. From the outside, the changes were barely visible: a small secondary scoop beneath the fuselage, new ducting hidden inside the cowling, minor alterations to the radiator exit path. Elegant, simple, completely unauthorized. "When do you want to test it?" Voss asked. McAllister checked his watch. "There's a mission brief at 900. If Pritchard clears it, we fly this afternoon. And if something goes wrong, then we find out together." 4 hours later, at 13:15 hours on March 14, 1944, Captain Lewis McAllister advanced the throttle and took off from Hollandia Airfield in a P-51B Mustang with an experimental cooling system that existed nowhere in any technical manual, had never been tested by engineers, and was about to prove whether one man's desperate theory could change the war in the Pacific. Henry Voss had not always been an engine cooling specialist. He had started as a mechanical engineering student at MIT, graduated in 1936, and spent 3 years designing industrial refrigeration systems for a meatpacking company in Chicago before the war changed everything. When North American aviation began recruiting engineers in 1940, Voss applied not because he knew anything about aircraft, but because refrigeration and engine cooling were fundamentally the same problem: moving heat from where it was to where it wasn't. The P-51 Mustang's cooling system was elegant in theory. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, built under license by Packard in the United States, generated enormous heat during operation. That heat was absorbed by liquid coolant circulating through the engine block, then pumped to a radiator mounted beneath the fuselage. Air entered through a scoop beneath the aircraft, flowed across the radiator fins, absorbed the heat, and exited through a duct at the rear. The system was efficient, compact, and proven in combat over Europe. But Europe was not the Pacific. The fundamental problem was thermodynamics. Heat transfer efficiency depended on the temperature differential between the coolant and the cooling air. In Europe, at 28,000 feet, ambient air temperature averaged -30 degrees Celsius. The coolant entered the radiator at 90 degrees. The air flowing across it was -30, creating a 120-degree temperature differential. Physics loved large differentials. Heat moved efficiently from hot to cold. In the Pacific, at the same altitude, ambient temperature was closer to -15 degrees Celsius, 15 degrees warmer than Europe. The temperature differential dropped to 105 degrees. That 12% reduction in differential translated directly to reduced cooling efficiency. The radiator couldn't shed heat fast enough. Coolant temperature climbed. Cylinder heads overheated. Pilots had to descend or risk catastrophic engine failure. Voss had identified the problem within 24 hours of arriving at Hollandia. The solution had taken longer. Traditional approaches wouldn't work. Enlarging the radiator would add weight and drag. Increasing coolant flow would require a larger pump, more weight, more complexity. Modifying the engine itself was impossible. The Merlin was a sealed, certified unit that couldn't be altered without voiding every warranty and regulation in existence. The answer, Voss realized, wasn't to change what existed, but to optimize how it worked. Airflow was the key. The radiator scoop captured air moving beneath the aircraft, channeled it through the radiator and exhausted it. But that airflow wasn't optimized. Most of the captured air hit the radiator at suboptimal angles, creating turbulence and reducing contact time with the cooling fins. Worse, at high altitude where air was thin, the volume of air moving through the scoop decreased proportionally with altitude, precisely when cooling demand was highest. Voss's modification addressed both issues. The secondary intake scoop he added beneath the fuselage captured boundary layer air, the slower-moving air that clung to the aircraft's skin, and injected it directly into the radiator ducting at a precise angle. This increased total airflow volume through the radiator by 18% without increasing drag, because the boundary layer air would have created drag anyway. The modification essentially harvested wasted aerodynamic energy and converted it into cooling capacity. The second part of the modification was subtle but critical. Voss added a series of small vanes inside the radiator duct that straightened the airflow, reducing turbulence and increasing the amount of air that made contact with the cooling fins. More contact meant more heat transfer. More heat transfer meant lower coolant temperatures. Lower coolant temperatures meant pilots could push engines harder at higher altitudes. The entire modification weighed 4 pounds, cost approximately $30 in materials, and could be installed in a field workshop with basic tools. It was elegant, simple, and completely unofficial. When McAllister had asked if North American knew about the modification, Voss had told the truth. No, but the fuller truth was more complicated. Voss had submitted preliminary cooling optimization proposals to North American's engineering department 6 months earlier. The proposals had been reviewed, deemed interesting but not critical, and shelved pending further analysis. Engineering committees didn't move quickly. They wanted data, simulations, wind tunnel tests, and approval from aerodynamics, structures, and propulsion departments before implementing any design change. Voss understood the logic. He also understood that pilots were dying while committees debated, so he had stopped waiting for approval and started improvising. The night before the test flight, Voss sat alone in the maintenance hangar, staring at the modified P-51 and running through failure scenarios in his mind. If the secondary scoop created unexpected drag, McAllister would notice reduced performance immediately. If the vanes disrupted airflow instead of optimizing it, cooling efficiency would decrease rather than improve. If any of the fabricated ducting came loose at high altitude, debris could be ingested into the engine with catastrophic results. But if everything worked, if the theory translated to reality, then McAllister would be able to climb to 31,000 feet and stay there, engine temperatures stable, finally able to fight Japanese fighters on equal terms. Voss believed the theory was sound. He had run the calculations dozens of times, checked every assumption, verified every measurement. But theory and reality were different countries, and the border between them was always guarded by unexpected consequences. At 600 hours on March 14, Voss watched McAllister's pre-flight inspection of the modified aircraft. The pilot walked around the Mustang slowly, checking control surfaces, examining the propeller, running his hand along the fuselage skin. When he reached the new secondary scoop, he crouched and looked at it for a long moment. "Doesn't look like much," McAllister said. 4 pounds of aluminum and $30 of materials, Voss replied. "But if it works, It's worth more than its weight in gold. And if it doesn't, then I go back to California and you get a new engineer." McAllister stood and extended his hand. "Either way, I appreciate you trying." They shook. Then McAllister climbed into the cockpit, strapped in, and started the engine. The Merlin coughed, fired, and settled into a smooth idle. Voss watched the exhaust stacks, looking for any indication of abnormal operation. Nothing. Everything looked normal. At 13:15 hours, McAllister released the brakes and taxied toward the runway. Voss stood beside Master Sergeant Holbrook, both men silent, watching the Mustang accelerate down the coral runway and lift into the humid Pacific air. "Think it'll work?" Holbrook asked. "I think we're about to find out," Voss said. For the next 90 minutes, they would have no idea if the modification was succeeding or failing. McAllister's mission was a combat air patrol over the Philippine Sea, climbing to maximum altitude and maintaining station for as long as fuel allowed. Radio communication would be minimal, standard check-ins, position reports, nothing about engine performance unless something went catastrophically wrong. Voss returned to the engineering tent and tried to work on other projects. He couldn't focus. He kept thinking about the secondary scoop, the straightening vanes, the 18% increase in airflow that existed only in his calculations. He kept imagining McAllister at 31,000 feet, watching his temperature gauge, deciding whether to trust an unauthorized modification designed by a civilian engineer who had never flown in combat. At 15:20 hours, the radio in the operations tent crackled with McAllister's voice. "Hollandia Tower, Blue Leader, requesting priority landing." Voss's stomach dropped. Priority landing meant something was wrong. He ran toward the flight line, arriving just as McAllister's Mustang appeared from the east, descending fast. The aircraft looked intact, no visible damage, engine running smoothly, landing gear deploying normally. McAllister touched down at 15:24 hours, rolled to his designated hardstand, and shut down the engine. Voss reached the aircraft as McAllister was climbing out of the cockpit. The pilot's face was unreadable. "Well?" Voss asked. McAllister pulled off his flight gloves slowly, deliberately. Then he smiled. 31,500 feet, sustained cruise for 40 minutes, temperature never exceeded 118 degrees. He clapped Voss on the shoulder. "Your modification works." Voss felt something break loose in his chest, tension he'd been carrying since the moment he'd started cutting aluminum 3 days earlier. No issues, no unexpected drag, no vibration, no. Nothing. The aircraft performed flawlessly, better than flawlessly. I had power and temperature margins I've never had before at that altitude. McAllister looked at the modified cooling system with something close to reverence. "How soon can you do this to the rest of the squadron?" "That depends on Colonel Pritchard. This was a test. One aircraft, one flight. Official implementation requires authorization." "Then let's go get authorization." 30 minutes later, they were standing in Pritchard's office. McAllister delivered his report with precision. Altitude achieved, temperature readings, engine performance, handling characteristics. Every metric supported the same conclusion. The cooling modification worked exactly as Voss had predicted. Pritchard listened without interrupting. When McAllister finished, the colonel turned to Voss. "How many aircraft can you modify per day?" "With a full machine shop crew, maybe 3 aircraft every 2 days. Call it 10 aircraft per week. We have 42 P-51s in theater. That's a month to convert the entire fleet." "Yes, sir." "And if North American objects to field modifications of their aircraft." Voss chose his words carefully. "Sir, North American built an excellent aircraft, but they built it for the European theater. What I'm doing is adapting it for Pacific operations. It's not a criticism of their design. It's an acknowledgement that different environments require different solutions." Pritchard studied him for a moment. "You're dancing around the question. Will North American be pissed if they find out we're modifying their fighters without authorization?" "Probably, sir." "Good. I'd rather deal with angry engineers than dead pilots." Pritchard stood. "You're authorized to modify the entire fighter group. I want every P-51 in this theater equipped with your cooling system within 30 days. Master Sergeant Holbrook will assign you whatever personnel and resources you need." "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me yet. If this modification fails in combat and we lose aircraft, it's my ass on the line." Pritchard looked at McAllister. "And yours. You're going to test every modified aircraft before it's cleared for combat operations. Understood?" "Yes, sir." They left Pritchard's office and walked back toward the flight line. The sun was setting over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Japanese fighters were preparing for tomorrow's missions, confident in their altitude superiority, unaware that the tactical equation was about to change. "How does it feel?" McAllister asked, "knowing you just changed how we fight this war?" Voss watched mechanics working on the flight line, preparing aircraft for the next day's missions. "Ask me again in 30 days when every Mustang in theater has the modification, and we see what happens in combat." "It's going to work." "I hope so." But hope wasn't certainty. And certainty wouldn't come until the modified Mustangs met Japanese fighters at 31,000 feet and proved that 4 pounds of aluminum and $30 of materials could shift the balance of air superiority in the Pacific. The modification spread through the fighter group like a controlled infection. 3 aircraft in the first 2 days, 5 more by the end of the week. By March 28, 18 P-51s had been retrofitted with Voss's cooling system enhancement. Each one was test-flown by McAllister or one of 3 other experienced pilots, pushed to maximum altitude, held there until fuel reserves demanded descent. Every test confirmed the same result: sustained operations at 31,000 feet with stable engine temperatures. But combat testing was different. Test flights happened in clear skies with predictable conditions. Combat happened in chaos. The first real validation came on March 30 during an escort mission to Wewak. 12 P-51s, 8 with modified cooling systems, 4 without, accompanied 24 B-24 Liberators attacking Japanese airfields on the northern coast of New Guinea. Intelligence predicted fighter opposition. Intelligence was correct. At 10:47 hours, 16 Ki-84 Franks dove out of cloud cover at 32,000 feet. The unmodified P-51s, limited to their thermal ceiling of 28,000 feet, stayed with the bombers. The 8 modified Mustangs climbed. McAllister's aircraft was the first to reach 31,500 feet. His temperature gauge read 116 degrees, 4 degrees below maximum continuous operating temperature, with power to spare. Below him, the Japanese fighters were completing their dive toward the bomber formation. Above him was nothing but empty sky. "Blue flight, blue leader, I'm going hunting." He rolled inverted and dove. At 31,000 feet, gravity and engine power combined to accelerate the Mustang past 450 miles per hour. The Ki-84s were focused on the bombers below, unaware that a Predator was dropping toward them from an altitude they assumed no American fighter could reach. McAllister selected his target, a Frank fighter pulling up from its firing pass, climbing back toward the safety of altitude. The Japanese pilot never saw him coming. McAllister closed to 300 yards, centered the Pipper and fired a 2-second burst. The .50 caliber rounds hit the Frank's engine and wing root. The fighter rolled left, trailing smoke, and fell away. "Splash 1," McAllister transmitted. The Japanese formation scattered. 4 Franks tried to climb above the Mustangs. 3 of McAllister's wingmen followed them up. At 32,000 feet, In air so thin that breathing required pure oxygen and concentration felt like physical labor, American and Japanese fighters merged in a twisting dogfight that neither side had expected to happen at this altitude. The engagement lasted 4 minutes. 3 Ki-84s were destroyed. 2 more were damaged and forced to break off. 0 P-51s were lost. When the fight ended and the bombers completed their run, the modified Mustangs descended to rejoin the formation, their engines having operated for 11 continuous minutes above 31,000 feet without thermal issues. In the debriefing, McAllister described the engagement with clinical precision. Altitude, temperature readings, engine performance, combat effectiveness. The intelligence officer took notes. The squadron commander asked questions, and every pilot in the room understood that something fundamental had changed. The Franks can't own the high altitude anymore, McAllister concluded. Not if we can climb up there with them. Word spread through the fighter groups in theater. The modification that had started as one engineer's theory was now proven in combat. Demand for the cooling system retrofit exploded. Squadrons at other bases requested the modification. Group commanders pushed their maintenance crews to work faster. By mid-April, 41 of the theater's 42 P-51s had been converted. The 42nd was awaiting an engine replacement and would be modified as soon as it returned to service. Voss worked 18-hour days, supervising installations, training maintenance crews, troubleshooting issues as they arose. He had become something between a consultant and a supervisor, moving between bases across New Guinea and the Philippines, ensuring every modification was installed correctly, checking fabrication quality, answering technical questions. He was exhausted, sunburned, and quietly satisfied in a way he couldn't quite articulate. For 3 years he had designed refrigeration systems for meatpacking plants. Now he was changing how fighter aircraft operated in combat. The work was identical, moving heat from one place to another, but the stakes were infinitely higher. On April 12, Voss received a telegram from North American Aviation Headquarters in California. The message was brief. Report to Inglewood facility immediately for consultation on P-51 cooling modifications. Travel authorization attached. He showed the telegram to Colonel Pritchard. They found out. Of course they found out. You've modified 41 aircraft in 4 weeks. That doesn't stay secret. Pritchard leaned back in his chair. What do you think they want? Either to yell at me for unauthorized modifications, or to ask how I did it so they can implement it factory-wide. My money's on both. Pritchard signed a travel authorization form and handed it across the desk. Go to California, tell them the truth, and if they try to shut down the modification program, remind them that their fighters can now operate at altitudes they couldn't reach before. Voss flew out of Hollandia on April 15, hitching a ride on a C-47 transport heading to Brisbane, then another to Hawaii, then a final leg to California. He arrived at North American's Inglewood facility on April 20, wearing a rumpled khaki shirt and carrying a briefcase full of technical drawings, performance data, and combat reports. The meeting took place in a conference room on the 3rd floor of the engineering building. 8 people attended, 3 senior engineers, 2 project managers, a military liaison officer from Wright Field, the head of propulsion systems, and a vice president whose name Voss didn't catch. They asked him to explain the modification. He did, using a portable blackboard to sketch the airflow paths, the boundary layer injection principle, the straightening vanes. He presented temperature data from 50 test flights. He showed combat reports documenting engagements at altitudes previously impossible for Pacific-based P-51s. When he finished, the room was silent for 15 seconds. Then the head of propulsion systems spoke. Why didn't you submit this through official channels? I did 6 months ago. The proposal was reviewed and shelved pending further analysis. And you decided to implement it yourself without waiting for approval. Pilots were dying because they couldn't operate at the altitudes where Japanese fighters were engaging. I didn't have time to wait for committee approval. One of the senior engineers leaned forward. You understand that unauthorized modifications void warranties, create liability issues, and violate contractual agreements between North American and the Army Air Forces. I understand that 41 P-51s can now hunt at 31,000 feet, and pilots are coming home alive because of it. The vice president cleared his throat. Mr. Voss, we're not questioning the effectiveness of your modification. The data speaks for itself. What we're questioning is the process. Proper engineering protocol exists for a reason. With respect, sir, proper engineering protocol takes months. The war doesn't wait months. The military liaison from right field spoke for the first time. Gentlemen, I think we're missing the point. The modification works. It's been combat proven. The question isn't whether Mr. Voss followed procedure. It's whether we implement this fleet-wide across all P-51 variants in all theaters. That would require retooling production lines, one of the project managers said, modifying existing technical orders, retraining factory workers. We're talking about a minimum 6-week implementation timeline. Then start now, the liaison said flatly. Because if theater commanders find out we're delaying a proven combat enhancement because of production logistics, they're going to lose their minds. The meeting continued for another 2 hours. They dissected Voss's design, challenged his assumptions, questioned his calculations. But the data was irrefutable. The modification increased cooling efficiency by 18%. It allowed sustained high-altitude operations. It had been proven in combat. Arguments against implementation were procedural, not technical. By 1700 hours, the decision was made. North American would incorporate Voss's cooling modification into all new P-51 production. Retrofit kits would be manufactured and shipped to every combat theater. The modification would become standard equipment within 8 weeks. As the meeting adjourned, the head of propulsion systems approached Voss privately. For what it's worth, he said quietly, your proposal 6 months ago wasn't shelved because we thought it was wrong. It was shelved because we had 70 other proposals competing for engineering resources and yours didn't seem urgent at the time. And now we realize that sometimes the urgent things aren't obvious until people start dying. He extended his hand. Thank you for not waiting for permission. They shook. Voss left the building and walked across the parking lot toward the guest quarters where he'd be staying overnight before flying back to the Pacific. The sun was setting over Los Angeles, painting the sky the same shades of orange and crimson he'd watched from Hollandia 3 weeks earlier. He thought about McAllister climbing to 31,500 feet, temperature gauge steady, hunting Japanese fighters that had ruled the high altitude unchallenged for months. He thought about the 41 modified Mustangs now operating across the theater. He thought about the production P-51s that would roll off assembly lines in 8 weeks, each one carrying his modification as standard equipment. The system had resisted, then it had accepted, and now it would forget that the modification had ever been unauthorized, absorbing it into official doctrine as if it had always been part of the design. Voss understood how institutions worked. The modification would be credited to North American engineering in technical manuals and historical records. His name would appear in footnotes, if it appeared at all. The story of how the modification was developed, one engineer working through the night in a Pacific Theater maintenance hangar, would be lost to bureaucratic sanitization. But the modification would endure, and pilots would live because of it. That was the only mathematics that mattered. By June 1944, every P-51 in the Pacific Theater had been retrofitted with Voss's cooling modification. The impact was immediate and measurable. Fighter squadrons that had been forced to operate below 28,000 feet now hunted routinely at 32,000. Japanese Ki-84 fighters, which had dominated the high-altitude environment for months, suddenly faced American aircraft that could match their ceiling and exceed their endurance. The tactical implications rippled through the theater. Bomber escort missions became more effective because fighters could engage enemy interceptors at any altitude. Combat air patrols covered larger volumes of airspace. Intercept missions caught Japanese formations that had previously flown above engagement range. The numbers told the story. Between March and June 1944, P-51 kill ratios in the Pacific Theater improved by 47%. Japanese fighter losses increased proportionally. Bomber loss rates dropped by 23% as escort fighters engaged threats more effectively. But statistics were abstractions. The reality was pilots like McAllister climbing through 30,000 feet without watching their temperature gauges creep into the red, maintaining combat power at altitudes that had been impossible 3 months earlier, turning altitude from a Japanese advantage into a neutral factor. On June 18, McAllister flew his final combat mission before rotating stateside. The target was a Japanese airfield at Davao in the southern Philippines. Intelligence predicted heavy fighter opposition. Intelligence, as usual, was correct. 32 Ki-84s intercepted the strike package at 29,000 feet. McAllister's flight, 8 P-51s, all with modified cooling systems, climbed to meet them. At 31,000 feet, the Mustangs had temperature gauges reading 115 degrees with power reserves available if needed. The engagement lasted 7 minutes. McAllister shot down 2 Franks and damaged a third. His wingmen accounted for 4 more kills. The Japanese formation broke off and retreated north, unwilling to continue fighting opponents who could operate at their altitude indefinitely. In the debriefing, the intelligence officer asked McAllister what had changed about Pacific air combat over the past 3 months. "We can breathe now," McAllister said. "We're not fighting with one hand tied behind our backs anymore." Because of the cooling modification. Because someone figured out how to make our aircraft work the way they were supposed to work in this environment. McAllister paused. "Henry Voss gave us back 3,000 feet of sky. Doesn't sound like much, but in combat, 3,000 feet is the difference between hunter and prey." McAllister returned to the United States on June 24, 1944. He was assigned to a training command in Arizona, teaching fighter tactics to pilots who would eventually deploy to the Pacific. He flew P-51s with Voss's cooling modification installed as factory standard equipment. New pilots learned to operate at 32,000 feet as if it were routine, unaware that 9 months earlier, that altitude had been impossible. Voss stayed in theater through August, troubleshooting issues, training maintenance crews, ensuring the modification was being properly installed and maintained. In September, he was recalled to California and assigned to a propulsion research group at Wright Field. He spent the next year working on cooling systems for next-generation fighters, jets that would make the Mustang obsolete within a decade. The work was cutting-edge, exciting, and entirely disconnected from the reality of combat. He missed the urgency of field engineering, the satisfaction of solving problems that killed pilots if left unsolved. The war ended in August 1945. Voss transitioned to civilian aerospace work, designing environmental control systems for commercial aircraft. He married in 1947, had 2 children, and built a career that lasted until retirement in 1976. His name appeared in 3 technical papers on aircraft cooling systems, published between 1945 and 1950. All 3 mentioned his work on P-51 thermal optimization in passing, crediting him as contributing engineer, without elaborating on the circumstances of the modification's development. In 1962, North American Aviation published an official history of the P-51 Mustang. Chapter 11 covered technical modifications and improvements implemented during wartime service. The cooling system enhancement was mentioned in a paragraph that read, "Improved radiator ducting, developed in 1944, increased high-altitude thermal efficiency, and extended operational sealing in tropical environments." No mention of VAS. No mention of unauthorized field modifications. No mention of the 3 weeks in March 1944 when one engineer worked through the night to solve a problem that headquarters didn't know existed. The history was accurate in what it described but incomplete in what it omitted. The modification had been developed in 1944. It had improved thermal efficiency. It had extended operational sealing. Every fact was correct. Every fact was also carefully sanitized to remove the human element, the desperation, the improvisation, the defiance of procedure in service of survival. Voss read the book once, smiled sadly, and never mentioned it to anyone. By 1950, the P-51 Mustang was being phased out of active service, replaced by jets that flew faster and higher than piston-engine fighters could match. The last operational P-51 squadron in the Air Force retired its aircraft in 1957. The Mustang transitioned from active-duty fighter to museum piece, air show performer, and aviation legend. Technical manuals and maintenance guides were archived. Engineering drawings were filed away. The institutional knowledge of how to maintain and operate P-51s gradually faded as the mechanics and pilots who had worked on them aged out of service. But the cooling modification endured in the historical record, though not in the way Voss might have hoped. It appeared in books about P-51 development as a footnote about improved thermal management systems. It was mentioned in academic papers analyzing World War II fighter performance. It showed up in museum exhibits describing technical innovations that improved aircraft capability. In every instance, the modification was presented as an institutional achievement, something developed by North American engineers or Air Force technical specialists. The narrative implied systematic research, committee analysis, and official implementation through proper channels. The reality, that the modification had been conceived by one civilian engineer in a Pacific Theater maintenance hangar, implemented without authorization, and proven in combat before headquarters even knew it existed, was absent from every official account. This was not conspiracy. It was how institutions naturally processed information. Official histories documented official processes. They described what was supposed to happen according to doctrine and procedure. Unauthorized field modifications, even successful ones, didn't fit the narrative structure of institutional memory. In 1968, the Smithsonian Institution acquired a P-51D for its aviation collection. The aircraft was restored to wartime configuration, including the radiator ducting modification that Voss had designed 24 years earlier. A placard next to the aircraft explained the Mustang's technical specifications, operational history, and combat record. The cooling system was not mentioned. In 1974, an aerospace historian named Dr. Robert Kinney published a comprehensive technical analysis of P-51 variants titled Evolution of the Mustang, Engineering Development 1941-945. Chapter 8 covered propulsion and cooling systems. The text included a detailed description of the radiator ducting modification implemented in 1944, complete with engineering diagrams and performance data. Kinney's source citations listed North American Aviation technical reports, Army Air Forces engineering assessments, and Wright field test data. There was no citation for the field modification report that Voss had written in March 1944, because that report had never been officially filed. It had existed as a handful of hand-drawn diagrams and a verbal explanation to Colonel Pritchard, nothing more. Without documentary evidence, Kinney had no way of knowing that the modification originated in theater rather than at a factory. His analysis was accurate based on available sources. It was also incomplete based on sources that had never been preserved. In 1983, Henry Voss attended a reunion of Pacific Theater aviation personnel in San Diego. He was 69 years old, retired, and suffering from emphysema that would kill him 4 years later. The reunion was poorly attended. Most of the men who had served in the Pacific were dead or too old to travel. 23 people showed up, including 4 pilots, 6 mechanics, and 13 support personnel who had kept bases operational across New Guinea and the Philippines. During the social hour, Voss found himself talking to a former P-51 crew chief named Bill Carrington, who had worked at Hollandia in 1944. "I remember you," Carrington said. "You were the cooling guy. You modified all our Mustangs." "That was 40 years ago. I'm surprised you remember." "Are you kidding? That modification changed everything. We went from temperature problems at 28,000 to clean operations at 32. The pilots loved it." "Did they ever know who designed it?" Carrington thought for a moment. "I don't think so. It just showed up one day as a technical order. We installed it and moved on." "That's how it always works," Voss said quietly. "What do you mean?" "The system absorbs innovations and forgets where they came from. The modification becomes doctrine. The doctrine becomes history, and history forgets the people who made it happen." Carrington nodded slowly. "I guess that's true, but the modification still exists. Every book about P-51s mentions the improved cooling system." "They mention the cooling system. They don't mention the people who designed it." "Does that bother you?" Voss considered the question. "It used to, not anymore. The point was never recognition. The point was solving a problem that was killing pilots. We solved it. That's enough." But late that night, alone in his hotel room, Voss wondered if it really was enough. He had spent 3 years designing refrigeration systems for meatpacking plants, then 1 month designing a cooling modification that changed fighter tactics in the Pacific, then 30 more years designing environmental systems for commercial aircraft. 3 decades of work, thousands of engineering drawings, dozens of systems that kept aircraft flying safely. And the only thing people remembered, if they remembered at all, was attributed to someone else. It wasn't bitterness he felt. It was something closer to melancholy. The knowledge that individual contributions vanished into institutional achievements, that names were forgotten while innovations endured, that history cared more about what happened than who made it happen. Henry Voss died on November 17, 1987, at the age of 73. His obituary in the Los Angeles Times mentioned his 40-year career in aerospace engineering and his wartime service as a technical consultant in the Pacific Theater. It did not mention the cooling modification. It did not mention that his work had allowed hundreds of pilots to hunt at altitudes they couldn't reach before. His daughter, Christine, found a box of papers in his study after the funeral. Inside were engineering drawings, performance calculations, and a faded technical report dated March 1944 titled "Proposed Radiator Ducting Optimization for P-51, Mustang High-Altitude Operations in Tropical Environments." She read through the report twice, understanding perhaps a quarter of the technical content but grasping the essential point. Her father had designed something important, something that had saved lives, and nobody had remembered. She contacted the Air Force Historical Research Agency and asked if they had any records of her father's work. The agency searched their archives and found 3 mentions of Henry Voss. A personnel record listing him as a civilian technical consultant assigned to 5th Air Force, March-September 1944. A mention in Colonel Pritchard's monthly report noting valuable assistance from North American aviation, engineering personnel. A single line in a 1945 technical assessment. Field modifications to P-51 cooling systems, implemented 1944, contributed to improved high-altitude performance. No details, no attribution, no acknowledgement of what he had actually done. Christine wrote a letter to the editor of an aviation history magazine, describing her father's work and asking if anyone had information about the P-51 cooling modification. The letter was published in the March 1988 issue. She received 2 responses. One was from a retired P-51 pilot who remembered the modification but didn't know who had designed it. The other was from an aerospace historian who confirmed that cooling system improvements had been implemented in 1944 but couldn't find documentation about their origin. That was the end of it. Christine kept her father's papers, stored in a box in her garage, and eventually forgot about them as life moved forward and other concerns demanded attention. The cooling modification remained. It was mentioned in books, analyzed in technical papers, and displayed in museums. But the connection between the modification and the man who had designed it was lost, buried beneath decades of institutional memory that preserved innovations while erasing innovators. Chapter 6: The Price of Anonymity. In 2004, the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, opened a new exhibit on World War II fighter development. The centerpiece was a restored P-51D Mustang, painted in the markings of the 357th Fighter Group, suspended from the ceiling in a dynamic climbing pose that suggested speed and power. Placards around the aircraft explained its history, specifications, and combat record. One placard, positioned near the fuselage radiator scoop, described the cooling system. The P-51 Mustang's liquid-cooled Rolls-Royce Merlin engine required an efficient cooling system to maintain performance at high altitude. Engineers developed an optimized radiator ducting system in 1944 that increased thermal efficiency and allowed sustained operations above 30,000 feet in tropical environments. No names, no mention of field modifications or unauthorized implementations, just a clean, sanitized narrative that credited engineers generically and suggested a deliberate, systematic development process. Christine Voss visited the museum in 2006. She stood in front of that placard for 10 minutes, reading the words over and over, feeling the familiar frustration of seeing her father's work described as if it had materialized from committee meetings and systematic research. She approached a museum curator and explained that her father had designed the cooling modification mentioned in the exhibit. She brought copies of his 1944 technical report as evidence. The curator, a retired Air Force officer in his 60s, examined the documents with interest. "This is fascinating," he said, "but without corroborating documentation from official sources, Air Force records, North American aviation files, combat reports that specifically mention your father, it's difficult to revise the established historical narrative. The combat reports exist, I have copies. Combat reports that mention improved high-altitude performance, yes, but they don't specifically attribute the cooling modification to any individual engineer. They just note that aircraft performance improved." He handed the documents back. "I'm not saying your father didn't do this work. I'm saying the documentation trail is incomplete, and without a complete trail, we can't make definitive historical claims." Christine left the museum that day understanding something fundamental about how history was written. It wasn't enough to have done something important. You had to have documented it properly, filed it through official channels, ensured that your name appeared in the right reports at the right time. If you solved problems through improvisation and urgency, if you didn't wait for permission or follow bureaucratic procedure, your contribution might save lives, but it wouldn't save your place in history. Her father had chosen results over recognition. He had fixed the problem when the system wouldn't move fast enough, and the price of that choice was erasure. In 2012, an aerospace engineering professor at MIT named Dr. Sarah Chen was researching World War II technical innovations for a book about field modifications that changed combat effectiveness. She was specifically interested in modifications that had originated in theater rather than in laboratories, solutions developed by people facing immediate tactical problems rather than systematic engineering challenges. Through a circuitous research path involving archived maintenance logs, she discovered a reference to unauthorized cooling system modifications implemented by civilian technical consultant H. Voss, March 1944, 5th Air Force. The reference was buried in a footnote in a 1945 maintenance report that had been digitized but never indexed. Dr. Chen tracked down Christine Voss through public records. They spoke by phone in September 2012. Your father may have been responsible for one of the most significant field modifications of the war, Chen explained. I've found evidence that the cooling system enhancement originated in theater, not at North American or Wright Field, but the documentation is fragmentary. I'd like to interview you about what you know. Christine sent copies of her father's papers. Chen analyzed them against archived technical reports, combat records, and engineering assessments. Over 6 months, she reconstructed the story. The problem, the unauthorized modification, the combat testing, the eventual adoption. She wrote a chapter about it in her book, which was published in 2014. The chapter was titled The Engineer Who Wouldn't Wait, Henry Voss and the P-51 Cooling Modification. It documented everything: the thermal sealing problem, the improvised solution, the 3-week implementation, the combat validation. It restored Voss's name to a story that had forgotten him. The book sold 3,200 copies, mostly to academic libraries and military history specialists. It was reviewed in 2 scholarly journals and mentioned in 1 aviation magazine. It did not become a bestseller. It did not revise mainstream historical narratives about the P-51 Mustang. But it existed, and in existing, it preserved a fragment of truth that might otherwise have been lost entirely. Christine read the chapter 3 times. Then she wrote Dr. Chen a letter thanking her for remembering her father when history had forgotten him. Chen replied, "Your father represents thousands of people whose contributions were essential but invisible. They solved problems when systems failed. They improvised when doctrine was inadequate. They saved lives through ingenuity and courage. And then they disappeared from the record because their solutions became so integrated into standard practice that no one remembered they had once been revolutionary. That's the price of real innovation. It works so well that it becomes invisible." By 2020, 76 years after Henry Voss designed his cooling modification, the P-51 Mustang had become an icon of American aviation. Warbirds flew at air shows. Restored aircraft sold for millions of dollars. Books, documentaries, and movies celebrated the Mustang's combat record and technical excellence. Every technical discussion of the P-51 mentioned the cooling system. Engineering analyses praised the radiator design. Aviation enthusiasts understood that the Mustang's range and high-altitude performance were partially enabled by effective thermal management. But the name Henry Voss appeared in exactly 3 places. Dr. Sarah Chen's 2014 book, read by approximately 3,200 people. A Wikipedia article on P-51 modifications that cited Chen's book in a footnote. An aviation forum thread from 2017, where 2 enthusiasts debated whether the cooling modification had originated in theater or at the factory. That was the extent of his historical footprint. 3 mentions, fewer than 5,000 people who knew his name, 0 museum exhibits, 0 official Air Force histories, 0 mainstream recognition. Meanwhile, the modification itself was everywhere. It appeared in technical manuals, engineering textbooks, and restoration guides. Every P-51 that flew at air shows carried Voss's ducting design. Every book that analyzed Mustang performance discussed the cooling system optimization. The innovation had achieved immortality while the innovator had vanished. This was not unique to Voss. Military history was filled with similar erasures. Sergeants who developed tactics that generals claimed credit for. Mechanics who solved problems that engineers later standardized. Enlisted personnel who improvised solutions that became official doctrine without acknowledgement. The system absorbed innovations and erased origins. It couldn't help itself. Bureaucracies documented processes, not people. They remembered what was supposed to happen according to procedure, not what actually happened in maintenance hangars at midnight when pilots were dying and no one had time to wait for approval. In 2023, a high school student in California named Marcus Voss, Henry's great-grandson, was assigned a research project on family history. He interviewed his grandmother Christine, who gave him the box of his great-grandfather's papers from 1944. Marcus read through the technical report, understanding almost none of it but recognizing that it represented something important. He Googled Henry Voss P-51 Mustang and found Dr. Chen's book chapter, the Wikipedia footnote, and the forum thread. He wrote his research paper about how his great-grandfather had changed fighter tactics in World War II through an unauthorized modification that the Air Force later adopted as standard equipment. He included copies of the original technical drawings and performance data. His history teacher gave him an A and suggested he submit the paper to a state history competition. Marcus did. The paper won third place in the regional competition and was published in a student history journal that approximately 400 people read. It was a small victory, but it was also a continuation, one more thread connecting the present to the past, one more person who knew the name Henry Voss and what he had done. That same year, a documentary filmmaker named Rachel Torres began researching a film about unsung heroes of World War II. She wanted to tell stories about people whose contributions had been essential but forgotten. The mechanics, engineers, and support personnel who had enabled victory without receiving recognition. She found Marcus's research paper through an online search. She contacted Christine Voss. She interviewed Dr. Sarah Chen. She tracked down archives at Wright Field and North American Aviation. Over 18 months, she reconstructed the story of the cooling modification with more detail than anyone had previously compiled. The documentary was released in 2025. It was 28 minutes long, titled The Engineer in the Hangar, and it told Henry Voss's story with archival footage, technical animations, and interviews with historians and surviving P-51 pilots who remembered when the modification was implemented. The film premiered at a documentary festival in Texas, won an audience award, and was later broadcast on a military history streaming service. Approximately 45,000 people watched it in the first year. It wasn't a blockbuster. It didn't change mainstream understanding of World War II history, but it gave Henry Voss something he had never received in his lifetime: recognition that his work had mattered, that his refusal to wait for permission had saved lives, that his innovation had changed how aircraft fought in the Pacific. Christine watched the documentary alone in her living room, crying quietly as interviews with historians explained what her father had done and why it had been forgotten. When it ended, she sat in silence for a long time, thinking about the box of papers in her garage that she had almost thrown away a dozen times over the past 30 years. If she had thrown them away, this story would have been lost completely. No documentary, no research paper, no Dr. Chen's book chapter. Just another name erased from history, another innovation credited to anonymous engineers, another individual contribution absorbed into institutional achievement. But she hadn't thrown them away. And now, 81 years after her father had worked through the night in a Pacific Theater maintenance hangar, people knew what he had done. It was a small victory against the gravitational pull of institutional forgetting, but it was a victory nonetheless. In the end, Henry Voss's story became a case study in how innovation actually happens versus how institutions remember it happening. The official narrative, the one in Air Force histories, museum exhibits, and technical manuals, described the P-51 cooling modification as a systematic improvement developed through proper engineering channels. It implied analysis, testing, and deliberate implementation. The reality was messier. It was one engineer in a maintenance hangar, frustrated by pilots dying because aircraft couldn't operate at necessary altitudes, working through the night to prove a theory that no one had authorized him to test. It was a colonel who prioritized results over procedure. It was pilots who trusted an unauthorized modification because the alternative was dying at 28,000 feet while enemy fighters circled safely above them. The reality was urgency, improvisation, and the willingness to break rules when rules were wrong. But institutions couldn't memorialize urgency and improvisation. They documented process. They recorded what should have happened according to doctrine, not what actually happened in the chaos of war. And so the modification became an engineering achievement, its human origin sanded away by decades of bureaucratic retelling. This pattern repeated across thousands of innovations, field modifications that became standard practice, tactical improvisations that became official doctrine, solutions developed by corporals and sergeants that were later attributed to colonels and generals. The system absorbed innovations and forgot innovators, not through malice, but through the natural process of institutional memory, which preserved outcomes while losing the messy, human stories of how those outcomes had been achieved. Henry Voss understood this. He had known, even in 1944, that his name would vanish from the record. He had known that the modification would be credited to North American or Wright Field or anonymous engineers. He had done the work anyway because the point had never been recognition. The point had been solving a problem that was killing pilots. In that, he succeeded completely. Between April and August 1944, P-51 loss rates in the Pacific Theater dropped by 23%. Fighter effectiveness increased measurably. Pilots who would have died at thermal-limited altitudes survived to fight at 32,000 feet. Those pilots never knew his name, but they flew with his modification. They climbed to altitudes that had been impossible 3 months earlier. They hunted Japanese fighters that had once operated with impunity above engagement range. The cooling system worked. The pilots survived. The modification became standard equipment. And Henry Voss became a footnote, then a forgotten footnote, then simply forgotten. Until a granddaughter kept a box of papers. Until a historian went searching for field modifications. Until a documentary filmmaker decided to tell stories about people who had changed the war without receiving credit. And then, 81 years after the modification was first installed, Henry Voss's name emerged from obscurity, not into fame but into memory, not celebrated widely but preserved specifically, not mythologized but documented accurately. It was a small resurrection. But for innovators whose contributions were erased by institutions, small resurrections were the only kind possible. The cooling modification endured. Every book about P-51 development mentioned it. Every restoration project implemented it. Every museum exhibit included it. The innovation had achieved a kind of immortality. But now, finally, the innovator had achieved something too: remembrance. Not in monuments or textbooks, but in the fragile human chain of people who kept papers, asked questions, did research, made documentaries, and refused to accept that essential contributions should vanish simply because they didn't fit institutional narratives. Henry Voss changed how fighter aircraft operated in the Pacific Theater. He did it in 3 weeks, working without authorization, driven by urgency and frustration, and the moral clarity that comes from watching people die from solvable problems. History forgot him for 70 years. Then history remembered. And in remembering, it acknowledged something important, that the innovations which change wars often come not from committees and laboratories, but from individuals who refuse to accept that the system's way is the only way. The thermal ceiling was broken by 4 pounds of aluminum and $30 of materials, installed by one engineer who wouldn't wait for permission. The sky remembers, even when humans forget. And now, finally, a few humans remember too.